All right, back here on Focal Point. My name is Steve Deace. You hear me each weeknight here on AFR. At least you will again starting next week here with the nationally syndicated Steve Deace Show. I'm filling in for Brian Fisher here today. There's a story on our website at stevedeace.com titled Reality Bites. Because we have what I call magical thinking in our society, and this is where we presume to believe to be true what we want to be true, whether or not it actually is. All right, and so we can debate a lot of the philosophical and moral aspects and components of a lot of the issues that come up that are contentious in our society today. But every once in a while, you run smack dab into reality. For example, I might believe with all my heart I can fly. If I jump off the tallest building in my city, I'm going to run smack dab into the reality of gravity. Reality bites, okay? So let me give you some reality here that we aren't talking about enough. Right now, birth rates in the United States are at an all-time historic low. In fact, the only age demographic where fertility rates are going up, women between the ages of 35 and 54, which is pretty much the oldest demographic they could increase. Talk to a lot of OBGYNs, they will tell you finding a woman who can get pregnant on her own regularly after 45 years old is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. So here's what that means. We are waiting longer to have families, and that means we're having smaller families too, since any medical study will tell you once a woman gets past 36, 37, 38 years old, pregnancy for her becomes a more problematic healthcare situation. The Pew Research Center says that if you're white, educated, and wealthy, you're having the fewest babies. In fact, the U.S. birth rate for foreign-born women right now is 50% higher. 50% higher than it is for American-born women. In 1990, just 16% of all U.S. births were to foreign-born women. Now, 1 of every 4 U.S. births is to a foreign-born woman. Now consider this. Currently, there are approximately 4 million more Americans on taxpayer-funded food assistance than working full-time in the private sector. Now, the reason that matters is because all government jobs, we are an AFR, so I think I can use moral absolutes here, correct? Okay. All government jobs are an economic loss leader. Every last one of them, even the vital ones. Military, police, fire, rescue, first responders, even the vital government job is a loss leader. And the reason why is government doesn't produce its own wealth or resources. It can only confiscate the wealth and resources of others. That's why you want limited government, folks. All right, because even good government is a waste. Even good government's a waste because it can't make its own resources, its own revenue. Private sector jobs must create and generate wealth/resources. Otherwise, they're not viable. So even though public sector employees pay taxes too, the bulk of the burden for funding government falls on private sector employees, since public sector employees are already taking wealth and resources from the private sector to make their jobs possible in the first place. And right now we've got 4 million more Americans on one of the 15 food stamp programs than we have working full-time in the private sector. Here's some other things to consider. The left likes to tout that the birth rate in Islamic countries like Iran is plummeting, and it is. There are some estimates that Iran's population could decrease by 50% in the next 30 years. But Muslim birth rates globally, and especially here in the West, are skyrocketing to the point that Muslims will be 1/4 of the world population by 2030. Great Britain is on pace to be a majority Muslim country by as early as 2050. The Muslim population in the United States has already doubled. There's analysis from the Heritage Foundation that the current scamnesty program being debated in Congress, which would grant U.S. citizenship to untold millions of illegal aliens, will cost you as a taxpayer at least $6.3 trillion. Now, that's primarily because these aliens, once they're normalized, they're going to be instantly eligible for every welfare state goodie bag. And since many of them are less educated and qualify for jobs that pay less than a middle-class standard of living, which is why they came here in the first place, they're going to need those welfare state bennies. So let's put this all together. So we've given you a lot of facts and figures, right? Let's put it all together into a clear picture so you understand what all of this means. The total world population by 2030, when my kids will take my place, or maybe your grandkids. By 2030, the total world population is expected to reach around 8 billion. Let's say 1/4 of the world population in 2030 does turn out to be Muslim, as this UN study suggests. That means there would be 2 billion Muslims in the world at the time your children and grandchildren take our place. Let's say only 1% of those Muslims buy into jihadist ideology. Do you know what 1% of 2 billion is? Now, I went to public school, so I had to look it up on the internet, okay? 1% of 2 billion is a worldwide jihadist army of 20 million jihadists. Let me put that number in perspective. According to history, do you know what Adolf Hitler's standing army was on September 1st, 1939, when he launched World War II by attacking Poland? His standing army, his standing uniform army, was 1.5 million. Look at the devastation the Nazis accomplished with that. Imagine now 20 million jihadists, not motivated by fealty or loyalty to state, but sincere religious belief, a real zeal. What kind of devastation could they cause? Not to mention the fact, when you look at what's happening to our birth rate, it's the lowest it's ever been. Who's going to stand alongside your children and grandchildren when those jihadists target them, when they are their generation's great Satanist? It also does take a math genius to figure out you can't sustain a business model that has more people cashing out of a system than paying into it. That's not sustainable. So with fewer people overall, more people on government assistance than producing wealth in the private sector, who's going to be paying for all this government compassion? Where's the money for this going to come from? Especially since it appears our ruling class in both parties, their master plan to replace the lack of babies born to more educated and wealthy families is to import a whole new class of welfare dependents from poorer countries to the south of us. Remember Jeb Bush? On our regular show, we've dubbed Jeb Bush America's Hispanic fertility czar. Stood up last week and said, well, we need to do scamnesty because Hispanics are more fertile. Okay, so are rabbits. I mean, you've got to offer me something other than that. That's not a policy. So we already don't have enough people paying into the system for the welfare recipients we have. Now we're going to import a whole new class of welfare recipients. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to stand next to our kids and grandkids when a potential army of 20 million jihadists want to behead them on the internet? Is there a solution to this? Near as I can tell, there's only one. It's pretty basic, pretty simple. I ran these numbers by a friend of mine yesterday who is a pro-family activist in my home state. And we were talking about these numbers, and he said, well, here's what this tells me. It tells me we've got to make sure our kids get married at a younger age and start living out the birds and the bees right away and often. Indeed. The reality is this whole thing called Western civilization might hinge on the Duggars. Now, maybe you think 19 kids is too much. I don't know. My wife is obsessed with the Duggars. Anything they write, anytime they're on TV, she just loves this family. So I hear about them all the time. I've got a friend of mine who's an editor at WorldNet Daily. He married his high school sweetheart. I think they're younger than us, and I think they're now on their 14th kid, right? We're going to need a lot more families than that. And a lot more of our families having a lot more kids. I'm going to be 40 this year. My wife's right behind me. So our window is closed. And I was just telling some young friends of mine who are married and haven't had kids yet. I was just telling them this week at my house. Greatest regret I have is that, and I was the problem. I was the problem. My wife wanted to go forth and multiply right away. I was selfish. You know, it was almost 7 years into our marriage before the Lord saved me. So I was thinking selfishly. I was thinking it was all about me, you know. And if I had to go back and do over again, we would have gone forth and multiplied a lot more often. and a lot earlier. Because in the end, we can have our conferences. I love our conferences. I get to speak at them sometimes. I get to go to them sometimes. And I love our conferences. We get together and we talk worldview and strategy. And that's great. We can have the greatest methodology in the world. We can have the most sound, systematic theology possible, known in the history of Christendom. Here's the truth. How will they hear the word if there is no one to preach it to them? We are not breeding ourselves out of existence here. This is really simple. The future of Western civilization literally may hang on whether our children want to have a lot of babies with one another. Because we can't sustain this current birth rate. It's just not sustainable. And in the end, we can write blogs and debate and vote, and those things are good and necessary. I encourage them all. I engage in them all. But it comes down to, in the end, sheer numbers. I'll go back to college football. One of the fiercest rivalries in college football is Alabama-Auburn. And, you know, Gus Malzahn's the new coach down there at Auburn University. He was their offensive coordinator when they won the national championship with Cam Newton a few years ago. So he clearly knows how to coach. Won some games at a smaller school, Arkansas State, last year. That's great. And he can know more about offensive philosophy and X's and O's and study more and be able to quote all the greatest coaches in the history of the sport, do things mentally and philosophically Nick Saban in Alabama can't do. But when Nick Saban walks onto the field at the Iron Bowl with 85 scholarship players and Gus Malzahn at Auburn doesn't have that, he's going to lose. So really what it comes down to is we need more kids. We need more babies, lots of more babies. We need more families like the Duggars. Otherwise, there's not a lot of long-term hope here for this thing we call Western civilization. More in a moment.